So now that we understand that there are these patterns to heredity, we've looked a little bit at who we consider the father of modern genetics. And we watched the video, Understanding Basic Genetics, and we learned about Gregor Mendel and how he's contributed to the current area of scientific study of heredity known as genetics. So we learned that Mendel conducted experiments with pea plants, and he was searching for patterns that might explain how traits are passed from generation to generation. So a trait, okay, is a specific characteristic that varies from one individual to another. What are some examples of traits in humans? Take a second, just jot down a couple of ideas here. Hopefully you've said things like hair color and eye color and height and whether people inherit genetic disorders. So hopefully you've got some ideas written down. And so how in the world did Gregor Mendel study these traits and actually discover that there was this factor that was being passed on? Well, there's some vocabulary that we need to talk about, okay? And you're going to use this vocabulary throughout this unit, so focus on these right now. P1 is known as the parental generation. It's the original generation in the study. It's the organisms that you're actually starting with, okay? The F1 generation is the offspring of the parental generation. They are known as the first filial generation. So if I were going to show you what that looks like, give me the pen here. Okay. Filial is spelled F-I. There, can you tell now that that's an I? Filial, okay? It means offspring. It's just another word for offspring. You can call it the first offspring generation or first filial generation. And then the F2 generation is the second filial. They're going to be the offspring of the F1 generation. Okay, so what typically they do especially when people are studying plants, is they will crossbreed the plants within the same generation. Okay, now what that did was it gave Mendel the opportunity to view how traits were passed from one generation to the next. So the idea is that an individual has two codes for every trait. These factors are called alleles, okay? This is going to be a really important word right here. So alleles, make sure you get that one. Mendel's principle of, alleles then interact to determine what form of a trait the individual possesses, okay? So two codes for every trait. Think about it. Where do those codes come from? Hopefully, you've said that those codes are in the genes, and the genes are located on the chromosomes. Think about the units that we've been studying here leading up to genetics. And where do those chromosomes come from? Oh, yeah, from the cells, right? But where did you come from when you were just a single cell? Well, you came from a sperm fertilizing an egg. And so you have one code from mom and one code from dad. That's where your two codes came from, your two sets of alleles. Now, Mendel came up with his first law of understanding in genetics. It's known as the principle of dominance. Okay, some alleles are dominant, others are recessive. Sounds simple enough, right? The dominant allele is usually the stronger form of a trait, and I put stronger in quotes because it's not like big muscles. Okay, it's just that it can cover up a recessive allele. It masks the recessive allele or recessive trait. The recessive or weaker form of a trait is only expressed in the absence of the dominant one. Okay, it's the only way you actually get to see it. Now, when we look at Mendel's P generation, he started out with this parental generation. He cross-pollinated a tall pea plant with a short pea plant. And what he found in his F1 generation was that all of the plants were tall. Which trait is dominant? Can you tell? Then when he crossed the F1 generation, those two tall plants, he ended up with mostly tall, but he had some short, just like in the P generation. So that made him wonder, I wonder how this works. I wonder how the dominant and the recessive traits, or these factors that I don't even know what they are, interact. Well, what he helped us determine in genetics is that when you receive both alleles of the same type, meaning both dominant or both recessive, okay, you're going to exhibit that particular trait, no matter what, okay? And that's referred to as being homozygous, or what we might consider a purebred or pure breed, okay? So if you receive a capital T and a capital T for tall, then that organism is going to be homozygous dominant for tall. If you receive a lowercase t, that would be homozygous for short, because that's the recessive trait. Now, heterozygous is when you receive two alleles that are different. So you get one dominant and one recessive. How do you suppose you should write that? Hopefully you got that you would write that as a capital T and a lowercase t, okay? So here, homozygous dominant, or you could be homozygous recessive, okay? Dominant is always written first because that's the trait that you will actually see in the individual, okay? That's why we put it first, because it actually masks that recessive. Now, there's two other terms, and I'm going to drill you on these four words over and over and over. You're going to be so sick of them. I hope you get them by the time we're done. Genotype is going to be the specific combination of alleles possessed by an organism. Okay? It's the form of a trait. The phenotype then is the form of a trait displayed by an organism. Here's how I remember these, and this is just me, but genotype are the genes. Okay? That's how I remember that one. It's the actual alleles. It's writing down whether someone is heterozygous or whether someone is homozygous. Do you follow me? You write down the homozygous dominant genes. That's their genotype, okay? The phenotype is the physical form of the trait. And so I remember this because, remember, I got to make a loop-de-loop there for my eyes. So physical, phenotype. Notice how they both start with PH? It's what I actually see in the physical individual. I can see that they received the dominant eye color, which is brown. Follow me? All right. Not that anyone's answering right now. That would be really cute if you actually said, yes, Mrs. Learned, I'm following you right now. That would be really funny. That would make me giggle. So let's take a look at Mendel's crosses. How did he figure out, based upon the different traits that he was looking at, what was dominant and what was recessive? Well, let's take a look at seed shape. Seed shape in pea plants are either going to be round or they're going to be wrinkled, okay? So when he crossed round versus wrinkled in the parental generation, he got all round. Which trait is dominant? Hopefully you said round, because it's only the dominant trait that shows up in the F1 generation. So yellow versus green seed color, which one's dominant? Yellow is. Gray versus white seed coat, gray is. When we look at the pod shape, it's either a smooth pod or it's a constricted pod where you can actually see the peas on the inside, and smooth is actually dominant. The pod color could be green or it could be yellow. Have you ever had green and yellow beans? Yum. Okay, I'm getting hungry right now. It's only second hour. So green is the dominant color. When we look at the flower position, where is the flower position? Is it axial, meaning is it lower on the stem, or is it terminal, up at the top? Okay, axial is actually dominant. So when we look at the plant height, tall versus short, tall is actually dominant. So based upon his crosses, as he went through, he studied almost 1,000 different pea plants, and he determined that when traits are passed on, there are two more principles that we follow in genetics and in heredity. So, what we're going to try and do throughout this unit is we're going to try and demonstrate each of these principles. So, the principle of segregation states that each parent passes one allele per trait. So, every parent, not that there's that many, there's only two, right? Both parents actually contribute to the traits of the offspring. Okay? An offspring does not receive all of its traits from one parent. Okay? Mendel's principle of independent assortment states that the inheritance of different traits are not related to each other. Blonde hair does not mean that the offspring is going to get blue eyes. Just because they're both recessive traits doesn't mean that somebody's going to inherit both recessive traits. Okay? There are people that have blonde hair and brown eyes. There are people that have dark hair and light eyes. So they have dominant of one and recessive of the other. So the inheritance of traits are not related to each other. The traits sort themselves independently. All right, this is where we're stopping